Namaskar. Can you hear me? Yes, okay. Amar Bangla khub bhalo na. So I'm going to speak in English, and I apologize in advance for my Missouri accent. I would like to begin my presentation today by first expressing my gratitude at being invited to speak at this excellent program on the auspicious occasion of the 175th anniversary of the birth of Shri Ramakrishna Paramahansa, whose teachings and example have transformed the lives of many spiritual seekers from the Western world, including myself. In the more than 100 years since he was introduced to the West by his renowned disciple, Swami Vivekananda, Shri Ramakrishna has been a guiding light to vast numbers of seekers, both directly through the Vedanta movement and the many Vedanta societies established throughout North America by the monks of the Ramakrishna order, but even more so indirectly through the variety of both Hindu and Buddhist teachers for whom the Vedanta movement paved the way, creating a subculture in the US and other Western countries marked by openness to the wisdom of what others might see as strange, foreign, or exotic teachers, with names like Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, Paramahansa Yogananda, Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada, Sri Aurobindo, Sri Ramana Maharshi, to name only a few. Behind all of these figures, who have changed Western thought and life in ways both subtle and not so subtle, stands the towering figure of Swami Vivekananda. And behind Swami Vivekananda sits the smiling figure of world teacher and avatar Shri Ramakrishna, immersed in Nirvikalpa Samadhi, in the infinite ocean of being, consciousness, and bliss, Satchitananda. I would also like to express how honored I feel that this, my first visit, not only to Belur Math, but to Kolkata, should be for the purpose of participating in this seminar that is in honor of Sri Ramakrishna. That my very first visit to this sacred place should be in the service of Sri Ramakrishna is something that I take to be a profound blessing. Although this is an academic presentation, I would like to request the indulgence of being allowed to begin my remarks on a personal note. This is not to draw attention to myself. It is intended to use my experiences as an example of the deep and ongoing relevance of Sri Ramakrishna's life and teachings to people in the Western world. At the risk of exaggeration, my thesis is that an understanding of Sri Ramakrishna's life and teachings is essential to the survival of humanity. Without an understanding such as that which Ramakrishna's life embodies, of the ultimate unity of all of humanity and of all spiritual paths, the conflicts among the religions of the world, between the world's religions and secular philosophies, combined with our increased technological abilities, are likely to lead to the destruction of all human life, or at least of human civilization. Like a time traveler from the future, Ramakrishna represents, I believe, the next phase in the evolution of human consciousness. Ramakrishna is our future, if we are to have one. My first encounter with Sri Ramakrishna was through a book on the religions of the world written by Huston Smith, a highly renowned scholar of religion who has been deeply influenced by the Vedanta tradition in North America. At one point in his career, Smith taught in St. Louis, Missouri. Smith met Swami Satprakashananda of the Vedanta Society of St. Louis and studied Vedanta with him. And it was Smith's account of Sri Ramakrishna that was my first encounter with this profound saint and sage. Interestingly, I also grew up in the state of Missouri, in a small town just 90 minutes drive from St. Louis called Montgomery City. I will not be surprised if none of you have heard of it. When I read Smith's book, I was 14 years old. I was very intensely interested in the religions of the world, and most especially Hinduism, because of the death of my father 2 years before. My father had been in a terrible accident, which eventually led to his death. These events inspired a search for answers and for spiritual meaning behind the phenomena of suffering and death to which all living beings are subject. Why do we suffer? What happens when we die? Is there a purpose? And if so, what is it to which all of this leads? My search led first to an in-depth engagement with the spiritual tradition in which I grew up, that of the Roman Catholic Church. However, while I found much in Catholic teaching to comfort and inspire me, there were areas in which I found this teaching to be lacking, particularly with regard to the question of the afterlife. I was also aware that the Catholic Church and the wider Christian tradition was but one tradition among many. Had I been born in Thailand, I would be looking for answers in Theravada Buddhism. Had I been born in Saudi Arabia, I would be looking for answers in Islam. And had I been born Jewish, I would be looking for answers in the teachings of Judaism. But I was an Irish Catholic from Missouri. Science, of course, is universal in a way that the world's religions are not. Its answers are available, at least in principle, to all. The results of scientific experiments are not dependent upon where one was born, though, as we have learned from quantum physics, the perspective of the observer does have a bearing on the outcome of an observation, at least in the study of subatomic particles. But I was not that interested in subatomic particles. Questions about meaning, morality, the destiny of the soul are not scientific in nature. I therefore took it upon myself to study the teachings and the scriptures of the religions of the world, in order to have a more complete picture of humanity's wisdom in the areas in which I was concerned. And that is how I ended up reading Houston Smith's book at the age of 14. Before reading Smith's book, my search had led me to read works by Mahatma Gandhi, which in turn led me to read the Bhagavad Gita, a copy of which I found, almost miraculously, at an outdoor market in the parking lot of the Methodist Church. Though I found wisdom in the various religious works and scriptures I was reading, the Tao Te Ching, the Buddhist scriptures, the Holy Quran, and of course the Bible and the works of the great saints and theologians from my native tradition, it was in the Gita that I found a wisdom that was, to my way of thinking, comprehensive and without limitation or flaw. I especially found its teaching of karma and rebirth to be compellingly logical. Even though I was Catholic at that time, I became and I remain an ardent believer in reincarnation. My searching and my personal theologizing, however, very quickly led to clashes with the very conservative Protestant Christianity that was the dominant tradition of rural Missouri, and indeed most of rural America even today. As a Catholic in a small town in Missouri, I was already a member of a religious minority. On several occasions, I had to deal with people, even adults, who told me I was going to hell, that I was condemned for all eternity because of my Catholic faith. And when, in the course of conversation, it became evident that I was not only a Catholic, but a strange Catholic who studied world religions and believed in reincarnation, they knew that I was going to hell. Only through having faith in Jesus Christ as my personal Lord and Savior, as understood by conservative evangelical Protestant Christians, could I be saved from eternal damnation. These encounters troubled me deeply. In retrospect, I believe they constitute a form of child abuse. For a child to be threatened with eternal damnation by an adult can be a traumatizing experience. In my case, however, it was a productive trauma, for it added fuel to the fire of my spiritual quest. How, I asked myself, could the God whose nature is said in the Christian Gospels to be love condemn entire civilizations to eternal damnation simply because they followed the religious beliefs and practices that their ancestors had taught them? Were not Christians doing exactly the same thing on a similar epistemic basis? Again, these same evangelical Protestants, had they been born in Thailand, would probably be equally ardent Theravada Buddhists. Had they been born in Saudi Arabia, they would be as convinced that the Quran was the Word of God as they were now convinced that the Word of God was to be found only in the Bible. In fact, how did they know that they were not going to hell? Maybe another religion was right. Maybe some of the exclusivist extreme Muslims that our previous speaker mentioned. Maybe they were right. And maybe the Christians were going to hell. If God is love, as Christianity teaches, it seemed to me that the ways to draw nearer to God had to be many. The path to the infinite could not be confined to one religion, one culture, one ethnic group, or one nationality. How could the infinite be limited to one religion? It was with these thoughts in mind that I read in Smith's book such quotes from the Gospel of Shri Ramakrishna as the following. God can be realized through all paths. All religions are true. The important thing is to reach the roof. You can reach it by stone stairs or by bamboo steps or by a rope. You can also climb up a bamboo pole. You may say that there are many errors and superstitions in another religion. I should reply, suppose there are. Every religion has errors. Everyone thinks his watch gives the correct time. It is enough to have yearning for God. It is enough to love God and feel attracted to God. Each religion is only a path leading to God. As rivers come from different directions and ultimately become one in the one ocean, all religions and all paths call upon their followers to pray to one and the same God. Therefore, one should not show disrespect to any religion or religious opinion. Now, I did not read this in the beautiful folk Bangla of Shri Ramakrishna. I read it in English, but it had a very powerful effect upon me. My heart sang with joy when I read these words, which resonated with the similar words of Gandhi, which I had also read. According to the Mahatma, religions are different roads converging upon the same point. What does it matter that we take different roads so long as we reach the same goal? This teaching of ultimate religious harmony, a position that I would later learn is called by scholars religious pluralism, seemed to be far more consistent with a God who loves everyone than the idea that entire religious communities are going to hell. Of course, just because an idea is attractive does not make it true. It is important to test all ideas against logic and experience. Here too, however, Ramakrishna goes even beyond Gandhi, basing his teaching on the harmony of religions on his practice of several spiritual paths. To again quote Shri Ramakrishna, I've practiced all religions, Hinduism, Islam, Christianity, and I have also followed the paths of the different Hindu sects. I have found that it is the same God toward whom all are directing their steps, though along different paths. He who is called Krishna is also called Shiva, and bears the name of the primal energy, Shakti. Jesus and Allah as well, the same Ram with 1,000 names. On the basis of direct experience, or spiritual practice, sadhana, undertaken from within a variety of religious traditions, Ramakrishna concludes that, I again quote, it is not good to feel that one's religion alone is true and all others are false. God is one only and not two. Different people call him by different names, some as Allah, some as God, and others as Krishna, Shiva, and Brahman. It is like water in a lake. Some drink it at one place and call it jal, others at another place and call it pani, and still others at a third place and call it water. But it is one and the same thing. Though I could not and cannot claim to have practiced many religious paths with anything like the degree of intensity and commitment with which Ramakrishna practiced his multiple religious sadhanas, with each of his practices culminating in the experience of samadhi, of complete immersion in the Ishtadevata, or chosen ideal divinity to which he had committed himself, his teaching certainly resonated and still resonates with my experience of seeking and finding profound wisdom in a variety of religious traditions and texts, as well as in the lives of the wonderful people of all religious backgrounds and of no religion, whom I have encountered in the course of my journey. In the worldview of Sri Ramakrishna, there are no religions that lead to hell. All lead like rivers to the one ocean of bliss. Sri Ramakrishna's relevance to the contemporary West, Part 1, Spiritual but not religious. In some ways, my spiritual journey is typical of those of many Westerners in our times. And in some ways it is not. If I may quickly take us from the 14-year-old Jeffery DeLong, reading the words of Ramakrishna in Houston Smith's The Religions of Man, to the Jeffery DeLong of today, my spiritual quest, which has also been an intellectual quest, has led me through several phases. During my teenage years, I tried to reconcile my beliefs, which became increasingly Hindu in character, with the teaching of the Catholic Church. While studying theology as an undergraduate at the University of Notre Dame, I realized that my worldview was irreconcilable with the teaching of the Church and all mainstream forms of Christianity. I therefore left the Church at that time. During my first 2 years of graduate school at the University of Chicago, I practiced a form of Hindu sadhana called Siddha Yoga, but I did not identify with any particular religious tradition. Then I met my wife, Mohua, who is Hindu by birth and Bengali, and connected more deeply with Hindu traditions through this personal family connection. And I finally became Hindu formally through the Arya Samaj. I have a certificate from the government of India that proves that I'm Hindu. I used it to have darshan of Padmanabha Swami in Kerala, so it worked. It had the stamp, so they let us in. Finally, about 9 years ago, I think, I became formally connected and affiliated with the Vedanta tradition of Shri Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda through meeting Swami Tyagananda of the Ramakrishna Vedanta Society of Boston. A large and growing number of Westerners, particularly in North America, have had a similar set of experiences to mine. Raised primarily in Christian, though sometimes in Jewish families, some kind of crisis or other profound and life-changing experience is the catalyst for their embarking on a search and finding the traditions in which they were raised to be in some way lacking. This experience can be traumatic, as mine was, involving the death of a loved one. Or it can be of a more intellectual nature, as some of my students have experienced upon learning for the first time about the richness and the depth of religions about which they previously knew nothing, or that they knew only in a distorted or stereotypical way, through inadequate high school courses or through images in the popular media. The spiritual seeker is a definite subset of American culture and is one that has a growing influence on the wider culture of our entire society. Some of these seekers, like myself, pass through a period of spiritual rootlessness, but eventually settle upon a tradition that satisfies both the soul and the intellect, as the Ramakrishna tradition has done for me. Though I disagreed with many of the teachings of the Catholic Church between the time I had ceased to identify with the Church and the time that I began to identify with Hindu Dharma, I missed being in connection to a tradition and a community. Simply practicing on my own as a spiritual free agent left something to be desired. I now identify that missing element with the Guru Shakti, the spiritual power that goes back through one's teacher to an enlightened being or avatar, like Shri Ramakrishna or Jesus Christ. In the Roman Catholic tradition in which I was raised, the power of a transmitted spiritual lineage is affirmed in the idea of apostolic succession, according to which all the popes and bishops of the Catholic Church can be traced through an unbroken lineage of ordination back to Jesus and his original 12 disciples, and in the case of the popes, back to the Apostle Peter. In the tradition of Ramakrishna, this transmission, of course, occurs through the monks of the Ramakrishna order and is traced ultimately to the Holy Mother Sharada Devi and finally to Ramakrishna himself. A large and growing number of Western spiritual seekers, however, choose not to affiliate themselves to any tradition at all, continuing to practice as, to return to the phrase I just used, spiritual free agents. So I am unusual in that respect, in connecting closely with a tradition. The term that most of these people use for themselves, in fact, is spiritual but not religious. So pervasive is this term becoming, in fact, that a new acronym, SBNR, has been coined among some scholars of religion to designate this group. Religion scholar and author Robert C. Fuller describes SBNRs in the following way, I quote, "Forsaking formal religious organizations, these people have instead embraced an individualized spirituality that includes picking and choosing from a wide range of alternative religious philosophies. They typically view spirituality as a journey, intimately linked with the pursuit of personal growth or development. Because they constitute a highly decentralized and difficult to define group, estimates of the percentage of the U.S. population that falls into this category vary wildly. Journalist Philip Goldberg states that, quote, SBNRs make up 16 to 39% of the population of the United States today. That's a pretty wide variance, 16 to 39. Incidentally, a few of my own students assisted Goldberg in transcribing data for the book from which this estimate is drawn. The book is titled American Veda, From Emerson to the Beatles to Yoga and Meditation, How Indian Spirituality Changed the West. This is a very important book. One of the Swamijis mentioned it the other day, and I highly recommend it if you can get it, American Veda. Goldberg also interviewed me for this book, and the foreword was written by Houston Smith, my gateway to Shri Ramakrishna. It is very important to distinguish this group, the spiritual but not religious, from skeptics. We are not talking here about atheism or the rejection of religion in its totality, but a rejection of religious organizations and institutions as anything other than, at best, a necessary evil, a means to an end, that end being a highly personal realization that is not limited to any particular tradition, scripture, practice, or teacher. What the spiritual but not religious phenomenon points to is something that arguably has been integral to Indian spirituality for millennia, and that the life of Sri Ramakrishna embodies to an extraordinary degree, arguably to its human limits, a path to meaning, wholeness, and happiness that is free to draw upon a variety of traditional resources. We're talking, in short, about spiritual eclecticism. If we take such eclecticism and the philosophy and theology that underlie it to be a distinguishing mark of Hinduism, one could argue that, although most of them do not identify themselves in this way, a growing number of Americans, the spiritual but not religious, are Hindus. In attitude and approach to the spiritual life, if not in name. This claim could be supported by the fact that many of the beliefs and sources upon which this population draws are, in fact, Hindu sources. My own grasp of this fact, coupled with a desire to identify with a tradition, is part of why I began to identify myself as Hindu long ago. I'm not the only person to observe this fact. It was also noted in a very controversial editorial for Newsweek magazine on August 31st, 2009, titled, We're All Hindus Now. In this editorial, the author, Lisa Miller, cites polling data that indicates that a staggering 65%, let that number sink in a moment, 65% of Americans believe that many religions can lead to eternal life. Yatomat tatopat, the great Mahavakya that we've heard many times. 65% of Americans, including a surprising 37% of white evangelical Christians. Not the people I grew up with, I think. The same data indicates that 24%, almost 1 in 4 Americans, believe in reincarnation, and that 30% identify themselves as spiritual but not religious. So think of this. Next time you see an American, there's a 65% chance that that person believes Yatomat Tatopat. And a 1 in 4 chance, 1 in every 4 Americans believes in rebirth, in reincarnation. I cannot speak for Lisa Miller, but I know that my own identification of spiritual eclecticism with Hinduism is in part a historical observation, but it also stems from my desire to be spiritually eclectic while at the same time identifying with an established spiritual tradition, one that allows and is indeed arguably defined by such eclecticism. In short, the tradition of Sri Ramakrishna lets us have our cake and eat it too. We're part of a tradition that is eclectic. It is significant, though, that the spiritual but not religious have made a conscious choice, often, not to identify themselves as Hindu, even those with beliefs and practices that are, for all intents and purposes, identical to beliefs and practices that Hindus have followed for many centuries, and indeed for millennia. If I can just give a brief aside here, I received an email from a close friend who argued at great length why she is not Hindu. And then at the end of her email, she says, I have to close now. It's time for me to do puja. I analyzed this fact in a paper, the fact that so many of these people do not identify as Hindu, in a paper for the Dharma Association of North America, or DANAM, in 2008, that was titled, Hindu, to be or not to be, 3 possible reasons for aversion to the term Hindu among Western practitioners. One of the reasons I found for this aversion was cultural prejudice. It is sadly the case that even among those who are open to ideas and spiritual practices from a variety of traditions and cultural points of origin, ethnocentrism and even subtle forms of racism are still visible in America. The term Hinduism is identified in the minds of many with what independent scholar Rajiv Malhotra has famously called caste, cows, and curry, a clever alliterative shorthand for all of that which is seen from a certain Western perspective to be exotic, strange, and backward about Indian culture. The deep truths of Vedanta and the practice of yoga, on the other hand, are de-Indianized and universalized. But this is not the whole story. The most important reason, from their own point of view, that the spiritual but not religious do not identify themselves as Hindu is because they do not wish to identify with any religious label. From their point of view, to label is to limit. To identify oneself with a particular religion or a specific tradition is to cut oneself off from the spiritual resources that might be offered in other religious traditions. At least that's the thinking. This understanding is an effect, one could argue, of the ways in which religion is traditionally understood in the West. According to the dominant understanding of religion in America, religion is an all or nothing proposition. You are either a Catholic or a Protestant, or Jewish or Muslim or atheist. The idea that one could be more than one thing, that one could be Christian and Hindu, or Jewish and Buddhist, or as many practitioners have been for centuries in Japan and China, a Buddhist and a practitioner of Shinto, or a Buddhist, a Confucian, and a Taoist. This idea is utterly foreign to most Americans. When I introduce Shri Ramakrishna and his multiple sadhanas to my students, they're puzzled. I might as well be speaking Bangla to them, actually. It does not occur to them. So if one wants to have an eclectic spirituality, if that's how you understand religion, as most Americans do, then if you want to be like Shri Ramakrishna, it means you cannot be religious. You have to be spiritual but not religious. The idea that there might be a religion, such as Hinduism, that is compatible with spiritual eclecticism is just not well known or widespread. Or it's viewed with suspicion. It's an attempt to lure people in. People think that it's a marketing scheme that has been developed. Again, my own preference for identifying with Hinduism is due in part to my own wish to have my cake and eat it too, to feel connected with the tradition while being free and even encouraged to pursue my spiritual eclecticism. But I think there is a wisdom in what the spiritual but not religious are saying, even if it is based on a very narrow view of religion. Indeed, it's a wisdom that I see as coming directly from the teaching of Sri Ramakrishna. For Ramakrishna did not teach that everyone should become Hindu, or that everyone was already implicitly Hindu due to being on a spiritual path. On the contrary, if the life of Ramakrishna means anything, it is that identities and labels are ultimately meaningless, and indeed potential obstructions to seeing the truth of the self, which is the same within all. The Atman is not Hindu or Buddhist or Muslim or Christian. It is all of these and none of these. It is the transcendent reality of who and what we truly are. It is that which we strive to realize, not our Christianness or Buddhistness or Muslimness or even our Hinduness. All these labels are an effect of our taking birth at a particular time in a particular place, as I realized in Missouri all those years ago. They are not who we truly are, much less what we're striving to attain. They have only a provisional utility. To use the proper Vedantic term, they are upadhis, limiting attributes, which conceal the infinite reality that is our true nature. Ramakrishna proved this, if we are to believe his own accounts of his experiences, by realizing the same reality, the same ultimate truth, the same God, in the ideals and through the practices of a variety of religious traditions. Was Ramakrishna a Vaishnav, a Shaiva, a Shakta? Was he a Hindu, a Christian, a Muslim? Yes, to all of the above. And no, for how can the infinite be contained in any of these limited, finite identities? Swami Vivekananda was very clear on this point when explaining that following the spiritual path was not about switching one label for another, but about following whatever religion, whatever version of the spiritual path one was following in a sincere and dedicated manner, but with respect and openness toward all others as well. To quote Swami Vivekananda, "Do I wish that the Christian would become Hindu? God forbid. Do I wish that the Hindu or Buddhist would become Christian? God forbid. The Christian is not to become a Hindu or a Buddhist, nor a Hindu or a Buddhist to become a Christian. But each must assimilate the spirit of the others and yet preserve his individuality and grow according to his own law of growth." End of quote. It is fair to say, I think, through the transmission of his teachings to the West, first by Swami Vivekananda, and then through the diffusion of Vedantic ideals that followed, both through the efforts of the Vedanta societies and their adherents, and the host of other teachers for whom Swamiji paved the way, that one of the major impacts of Shri Ramakrishna on Western culture is the spread of spiritual eclecticism. The growing number of Americans who identify themselves as spiritual but not religious are, whether they know it or not, Ramakrishna's children. One could debate whether by steadfastly refusing to identify themselves with any particular tradition, that they might be depriving themselves of important spiritual resources. For Ramakrishna also did not say, practice no religion. He said, love all, respect all, be open to all. At the same time, those of us who do identify our spiritual eclecticism with the Hindu tradition are given a reminder by these principled non-joiners to avoid Hindu chauvinism. We may wish to be mindful that the very eclecticism on which we pride ourselves can itself become a way for the ego to assert its superiority over the other and to congratulate itself for how wonderfully tolerant and open-minded it is, unlike the other toward which it claims to be open and tolerant. We're very open to these people, but they're not open. It is a lesson I believe Ramakrishna would want his devotees to take to heart. Shri Ramakrishna's relevance to the contemporary West, Part 2, Saving the World. The number 108 has very deep significance in the spiritual traditions of India, appearing repeatedly in the stories, texts, and practices of the Hindu, Buddhist, and Jain traditions. Its sanctity is illustrated, for example, by the fact that a mala, or string of prayer beads, is made up of 108 beads on a thread, with the 109th symbolizing Mount Meru and not being numbered among the beads on which one keeps count of one's mantra while meditating. On September 11th, 1893, Swami Vivekananda delivered his famous first address to the Parliament of the World's Religions in Chicago, in which he declared his fervent hope that fanaticism and intolerance would soon be brought to an end. Exactly 108 years later, this is one of the strangest facts that I've ever encountered. 108 years to the day, on September 11th, 2001, an event occurred in the history of my country and in world history that is likely to be remembered as a victory for the very forces of fanaticism and intolerance for whose end Swamiji had so fervently hoped. I remember the day quite vividly. I was teaching an Indian philosophy class that morning in which I was explaining to my students the concept of pramana. Distracted by a growing gathering of students in the classroom across the corridor, which was equipped with a television set, I ended my class, and my students and I went to see what seemed to be capturing the attention of so many people. We entered the room and began watching the television, just in time to see the collapse of the Twin Towers in New York City, as well as hearing of the attack on the Pentagon and the plane that had crashed in Pennsylvania, which was just down the road from where we were. At this point, my wife and I were in our second year of teaching at Elizabethtown College. Just 15 months earlier, I had received my doctoral degree from the Divinity School at the University of Chicago, for which I had written a dissertation titled Plurality and Relativity, Whitehead, Jainism, and the Reconstruction of Religious Pluralism. I was in the course of building upon the argument of my dissertation and developing what in a few more years would become my first book, Vision for Hinduism. The point of my dissertation, as well as my first book, and many of the articles I've written subsequently, was to develop a persuasive philosophical argument for Shri Ramakrishna's teaching of the harmony of religions, or religious pluralism. For while on an intuitive level, I see this teaching as very profoundly and importantly true, it's also a teaching that raises a host of very difficult questions. I have taken addressing these questions to be my central task as a theologian and philosopher of religion who is in the tradition of Vedanta taught by Shri Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda. For I am persuaded, as I mentioned at the start, that it is vital to the future survival of humanity that we find a way to see religious difference in a way that respects the distinctness of each tradition while also affirming the unity of all. On that September morning in 2001, though, I almost despaired. Returning to my office after finding my wife and making sure that she was all right and knew about what had happened, I found my just barely begun book manuscript, on which I'd planned to work that day. And I was struck by what seemed to be the futility and the hubris, the pride of the task that I had set for myself. Would anything I could ever write or say bring back the thousands who died on September 11th, or fill the holes in the lives of their families, or bring back the many, many more lives that would surely die in the wars of vengeance that I knew would come? How could a book or a dissertation or a conference or a seminar or a curriculum even begin to respond to the pain that erupted into the world on that day, or the hate that created it? I closed my eyes to meditate, and as my mind gradually became calm, the thought arose. Now more than ever, you need to write this book. You have a responsibility to write it. If any good can come out of it at all, you must do it. You must speak the truth as you see it. In addition to, and in part connected with, the phenomenon of the spiritual but not religious, the other major impact of Sri Ramakrishna on the West has been in the form of his teaching of the harmony of religions. A version of this idea had already arisen in the Western world in the form of the Unitarian and Universalist movements, which have now merged into a single association, as well as some iterations of the wider movement of modernity itself, known as the Enlightenment, in which reason and experience gradually came to substitute for church authority as guides to the truth. The early modern author Michel de Montaigne, who lived from 1533 to 1592, famously wrote, "We are Christians by the same title that we are Perigordians or Germans." He was acknowledging, in other words, that one's religious affiliation is as much an accident of birth as one's nationality. An upadhi, he would have said if he had known Sanskrit. How then could anyone be condemned by a just God for practicing the religion of one's birth? The Unitarian movement influenced, through one of its most celebrated American adherents, Ralph Waldo Emerson, by Hindu thought, affirmed the basic goodness of all people. And universalism was a current within Christian thought, which affirmed that the love of God, being infinite and unconditional, could tolerate the damnation of none of his children, and that all would eventually be saved no matter what their religious belief. It was with Sri Ramakrishna's teaching of the harmony of religions, though, as transmitted by Swami Vivekananda, that this idea began to take a firm hold in the Western world. Its preeminent advocate in the early and mid-20th century was the philosopher and author Aldous Huxley, a disciple of Swami Prabhavananda and a British expatriate who settled in California and, along with his contemporary Christopher Isherwood, became a major fixture at the Vedanta Society of Southern California. Huxley's classic work, The Perennial Philosophy, defends the ideal of the harmony of religions by arguing that there is a shared core of experiential wisdom at the heart of all the world's religious traditions, whose texts he quotes quite liberally in order to prove the existence of, I quote, "the metaphysic that recognizes a divine reality substantial to the world of things and lives and minds, the psychology that finds in the soul something similar to, or even identical with, divine reality, the ethic that places man's final end in the knowledge of the immanent and transcendent ground of all being." End of quote. Huxley's approach, widely known as perennialism, had a strong influence on a range of prominent philosophers, theologians, and scholars of religion, including the aforementioned Huston Smith and John Hicks. John Hicks, a British philosopher of religion, took Huxley's approach and sought to improve upon it, developing it into a full-blown systematic philosophy of religion. One of the main criticisms of Huxley is that the scriptural texts that he cites from the world's religions, beautiful though they are often taken out of context, making the world's religions appear more convergent and harmonious than they in fact often are. Hicks replaces this approach with his pluralistic hypothesis. Hicks, again very much intellectually in the lineage of Huxley, Vivekananda, and ultimately Ramakrishna, proposes what he calls a Copernican revolution in the ways in which religious traditions see themselves in relation to truth and ultimate reality. Just as people in medieval Europe widely believed that the earth was the center of the universe, around which the sun revolved, being convinced only gradually by Copernicus' view that the earth is just one planet among many revolving around the sun, Hicks similarly claims that religions traditionally identify themselves with the truth, in terms of which all other religions are to be measured, and either found praiseworthy or all too often wanting. But in place of this medieval model, Hicks claims that the awareness that there is wisdom and goodness to be found in many religions, and that all religions, including one's own, have been used to justify evils such as war, slavery, persecution, and the oppression of women, should lead us to see our own religion as just one more planet circling around the sun of the truth, which shines upon all, to varying degrees and in varying ways. Unfortunately, and I'll spare you the highly technical details given the limitations of time, Hicks' approach does not allow us to say with any specificity what the truth is or might be. He essentially states that the nature of ultimate reality cannot be known, other than the fact that it transforms those who encounter it in many positive ways, thus leading to the emergence of the great saints and sages of the world's religions. Ultimate reality, Hicks says, and I quote, cannot be said to be one or many, person or thing, substance or process, good or evil, purposive or non-purposive. None of the concrete descriptions that apply within the realm of experience can literally apply to the unexperienceable ground of that realm. Now, in one sense, Hicks appears to be onto a very profound truth. In his sort of neti-neti way, he seems to be talking about Nirguna Brahman, the highest reality that is beyond all upadhis, all limiting and differentiating qualities. At the same time, though, Hicks denies that ultimate reality can be experienced as it truly is by those in human form. According to Hicks, the real can be experienced only phenomenally, as structured by human consciousness. But this is directly contrary to the experience of Shri Ramakrishna and numerous other sages, of whom it is believed that they did indeed transcend the realm of namarupa, or name and form, to experience ultimate reality as it truly is, in its true nature. Any attempt to teach those who have not had this experience, of course, requires the teacher to resort to that with which his listeners or her listeners are familiar. Unless one takes a purely negative, neti-neti approach, as some of the sages of the Upanishads do, as well as the Buddha. But to say that one never does go beyond the realm of name and form, at least in this life, is to deny the experiences of many of the sages of the world's religions, the very sages that the teaching of the pluralistic hypothesis is supposed to affirm. It also denies the experience of contemporary practitioners who have achieved this state of transcendence. I would recommend, for example, the works of Robert Foreman on what he calls pure consciousness events. If one does not take Hicks' approach, however, deferring the ultimate truth and the nature of the real to what he calls the realm of eschatological verification, that is, the idea that we will only know these things after we die, if one does not take that approach, one is left with the greatest difficulty that Ramakrishna's religious pluralism raises. And that's the question of how it is that many different religions, all making different truth claims, can all be true in some sense and lead to the same ultimate goal, even when they conceive of those goals in radically different terms. Again, to spare you the technical details, much of my work has been aimed at answering this question, tapping into Jain philosophy, the philosophy of Alfred North Whitehead, and a number of other sources. Briefly, my claim is that beyond the teachings and practices that they share, as illustrated by Huxley and the Perennialists, the differences among the world's religions also include truths that are deeply significant and that allow for the possibility of their learning from one another through dialogue. Affirming with Hicc that all religions have the ability to transform their practitioners in positive ways, I also wish to affirm that it is possible to experience ultimate reality in its true nature, as Ramakrishna did, and as other sages as well. Rather than saying that ultimate reality is inexperienceable and that ultimate truth is unknowable, I argue rather that ultimate reality lends itself to, that is, it is in its nature to appear as many, many things in many, many ways, which are all true, but none of which is comprehensive. In short, that ultimate reality is complex. I think in many ways I'm echoing the previous paper that Swamiji presented. Ramakrishna points us toward this complexity when he affirms that the polar opposites of reality, as these are seen in various traditions, the active relative form of divinity as personal reality and the impersonal absolute beyond time and space, are one and the same. Both lila and nitya, relative and absolute, are one reality. To again quote Ramakrishna, Kali is verily Brahman and Brahman is verily Kali. It is one and the same reality. When we think of it as inactive, we call it Brahman. When we think of it as active, we call it Kali. And I would add Krishna or Jesus or any of the various names of the divine person to whom the world's religions relate. Pravajika Vrajaprana develops a metaphor that illustrates this perspective. In her words, I quote, "The world's spiritual traditions are like different pieces in a giant jigsaw puzzle. Each piece is different, and each piece is essential to complete the whole picture. Each piece is to be honored and respected, while holding firm to our own particular piece of the puzzle. We can deepen our own spirituality and learn about our own tradition by studying other faiths. Just as importantly, by studying our own tradition well, we are better able to appreciate the truths in other traditions." Conclusion. Shri Ramakrishna's importance for our times cannot be exaggerated. On the basis of his direct experiential awareness of ultimate reality through the matrices provided by various spiritual traditions, it is possible to develop a pluralistic approach to truth that draws upon the insights of a vast array of human religious experience, as well as upon the findings of modern science and secular philosophies. Here I have only been able to give a very rough, evocative outline of this way of thinking. But it is a way of thinking that I believe is an essential, a necessary, but probably not sufficient condition for bringing about a lasting peace among the various warring systems of belief that compete and struggle for survival in our world today. If we can begin to see one another not as the other, but as fellow travelers on the spiritual path, who are pursuing the same ultimate goal in our own ways, we might be able to go some distance toward a more peaceful, habitable world. Other issues also need to be addressed, such as social justice, the scarcity of resources, and the ecological crisis that is of vital concern to all. But if humanity's conflicts are ever resolved, Shri Ramakrishna's life and teaching will certainly be a part of that resolution. Shri Ramakrishna Karuname Sharanam.